Hello and welcome to the Univest Public Media Center. My name is Jim Deegan. I'm the editor at LehighValleyNews.com. We are delighted to have you here tonight for this special presentation. It is a Lehigh Valley Plus live event, a conversation with Dr. Stephen Tang. We at LehighValleyNews.com launched our website about 7 months ago in October. It is the region's only free, nonprofit local news website. Most of the content is free. You can check it out at LehighValleyNews.com. I would appreciate it if you like what you see and you have it in your heart. You can support us at LehighValleyNews.com. Join. With us tonight is Dr. Stephen Tang and Brittany Sweeney. Dr. Tang was the president and CEO of OraSure Technologies here in Bethlehem from 2018 to 2022. Prior to that, he was, for 10 years, the driving force behind University City Science Center in Philadelphia. Also with us tonight is Brittany Sweeney. You may recognize her from her work at PBS 39. She also, her work also appears on 91.3 WLVR, as well as LehighValleyNews.com. She, during the pandemic, interviewed Dr. Tang in the height of the pandemic about what was happening at OraSure and what was happening in the world. So very happy that you're here. This is casual. It's going to be a conversation of about 30 minutes. Afterwards, you'll be escorted out in the lobby for the book signing. But if during the conversation you have a question, please, by all means, raise your hand. We'll get somebody over to you. We just ask that you stand up and ask your question as you're addressing Stephen and Brittany. So with that, we'll start, and I'm going to throw it over to Brittany.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jim, and thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening, as well as Dr. Stephen Tang. And as Jim just mentioned, we have talked numerous times before, but mostly via Zoom because it was during the coronavirus pandemic, so it's wonderful to have you in person this evening.
It's great to be here, Brittany.
So as Jim mentioned, you were president and CEO of OraSure Technologies. Let's start there. How did you get to that point? Let's talk about your journey.
Boy, that's, when I think about that question, I think about three things. The Beatles song, The Long and Winding Road, that leads you home, right? I think about Grateful Dead fans. You know, sometimes the light is shining on me, other times I can barely see, right? It's been a long, strange trip. That's that part of it. But mainly, I'd say it reminds me of the Forrest Gump movie. 50 years history that kind of brought me to the Lehigh Valley and then to OraSure. So I'll give you some of the signposts along the way because I think it's kind of a remarkable story. I came to Lehigh Valley in 1982. If you were here in 1982 at this site, you might get run over by a huge earth-moving or steel-moving piece of equipment. This is part of the steel site. OraSure is a couple blocks away, so OraSure wasn't there either. I remember I had to come into the facility one time because we were, like graduate students do, because I was a graduate student at Lehigh, we come and forage for you know, unwanted office equipment and things like that, and they were getting rid of a lot of those things here at the steel. And there was a big sign up that said, parking for American cars only. Park your Japanese car in Tokyo. A little passive-aggressive mood in the valley at that time. So it was 1982. 1987, the company that would become OraSure Technologies, which was called Solar Care Technologies, was founded. I was a graduate student here. During that time, I learned some things about economic development, which we'll talk about a little later. But Ben Franklin Technology Partners had just started. I actually, as a graduate student, reviewed some of the proposals that Solar Care Technology made for funding to Ben Franklin. So that was my first little glimpse of who OraSure was and would be. And then a couple years later, so now we're going from the 80s to the 90s, right, 5 decades here, right? I became their landlord. I stayed on at Lehigh to be the general manager of their biotechnology research center, and they needed some space as a startup company, and so I became their landlord. Got to know their founders, Mike Gosling, Bill Hitchie, Sam Nibala, And then I sort of lost track of them. And I went on to do other things. I became friends with Mike because our sons were friends in school, very neighborhood kind of things that we do here in Lehigh Valley. And then fast forward to 2004, OraSure had gone public in 2000, and I had gotten to know Mike Gosling. Mike's board at that time wanted to make a change in CEO, and Mike said, "You should apply for the job." So I applied for the job. I didn't get it. Okay, and I went on to instead go work for Olympus, which had just come to Lehigh Valley. And so very disappointed. I thought that was the end of the story, and that was a nice attempt, but wasn't meant to happen. Then by 2011, the CEO who got the job, who actually was a consulting client of mine back in the 90s, asked me to be on his board. And so I was surprised by the offer, but then joined his board. Funny things happen in life. I became chairman of the compensation committee, so I got to determine the compensation of the CEO who got the job that I didn't get.
How'd that work out?
Well, we were all very professional about it.
Absolutely.
We worked with numbers, it was very analytical. But then by 2016, I had become chairman of the board, and the CEO decided he was going to retire. So the chairman of the board typically runs the search process for the next CEO, and the board tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Why don't you apply for this job?" It's not, I just want to make clear, this is not like a Dick Cheney situation where I recommended myself for the job. This happened in a very different way. And then I became CEO of OraSure in 2018. Little did I know there was going to be a pandemic in 2020. So that's a long stem winder, okay? But what I'd like to point out about that is over that course of 5 decades, my career moved an entire distance of 0.7 miles between where I first lived on Wyandotte Street here in Bethlehem to where OraSure's headquarters are right now on East First Street. So that's a very long answer to your question, but I think it's indicative of a number of things. You just don't know how things are going to work out. As Forrest Gump said, life is like a box of chocolate. You never know which one you're going to get, which I think is a lesson about maintaining relationships, being open to opportunities, and making the best of the situation whenever you can.
Sure. It seems like it came full circle for you.
Very much so.
In those decades.
It did. I mean, I lived in Lehigh Valley for 31 years, so this is very much home to me. It's the longest I ever lived in one place. Raised my family here, got to know a lot of people, a lot of whom are graciously here today. It's like my life is flashing before me with people from Lehigh that I know from the 1980s to some of my former OraSure colleagues, some of my former Olympus colleagues, some folks who used to be my neighbors. This is just wonderful. It just warms my heart to be here and to talk about the community and talk about what we did at OraSure.
Wonderful. It's great to have you, and that's what we're here for, to talk a little bit more about OraSure. We're going to talk about your book shortly, but during the pandemic, OraSure was awarded a federal grant for about $600,000, and that was to create a rapid antibody test for testing of the coronavirus. So talk to us about leading through the coronavirus and this race to get these tests out, because we saw this race across the country when it comes to different testing and treatments. So talk about leading through that pandemic that, like you said, we never saw coming.
Well, fortunately, there are folks from OraSure here to check me on the story. So if I use a little too much hyperbole, tamper me down a little bit. But it was a remarkable time for all of us. None of us saw this pandemic happening. Fortunately, I think some of us and some companies had the wherewithal to be able to address the situation. It's interesting, looking back on it, the initial grant that we got to develop OraSure through a government agency called BARDA eventually led, you mentioned $600,000 worth of funding initially. That parlayed into over $600 million or so of government funding overall. So this was a massive expansion for OraSure Technologies, completely transformed the company. If you look at the revenue of the company over the pandemic, it went from the hundreds to the 200s to the 300s Now they're on track for 400s this year. So that's just remarkable growth for any situation. There's manufacturing capacity is increased by a factor of 5 or 6. The employees have almost doubled over that period of time. But I think that the most important consequence from a product perspective is InteliSwab, which is this remarkable one-piece device. It's the only one-piece test on the market. Oprah Winfrey's company calls it the easiest test of its kind to use. It was the standout product in drugstores in 2021. OraSure had some remarkable products, but they were mostly niche products used for important purposes like detecting HIV or Ebola or hepatitis C. But now you're talking about a product that was going to be used by everybody. And that's really a game changer. And it was really an incredible opportunity, an incredible leadership challenge to get people to pull in the same direction, bring in new talent, and really make the company very different. So now the company, I think, is poised to play a bigger role if it wants to in global public health. The coronavirus is not going to go away overnight. There'll still be needed to test, even though the emergency will be officially over on May 11th. I don't think the virus knows that the emergency is going to be over on May 11th, so there's a lot more work to do. But, in this community of Bethlehem, where this company began back in the 80s, it's just been remarkable progress. So I just feel fortunate to be having worked with this remarkable group of people, some of whom are here tonight, they are the real heroes of this story. I was fortunate enough to be there and be one of the leaders there, and more or less a translator between approvals from the board down to the kind of resources and people and staff and machines and things that we needed to bring on board, and the new facilities we had to create.
Sure, and your time spent there, your experience that you talk about there is in your book. So let's turn to that book. What inspired you to put pen to paper and write a book, A Test for Our Time, Crisis Leadership in the Next Normal?
Well, there are several dimensions to that. The first, there's a Chinese proverb that says, "A single joy trumps many griefs." And so the first reason I wrote it was, I think we had gone through some miserable times during the pandemic. And I thought this was a very uplifting story, what we did together at OraSure. And I think stories like that are just starting to emerge in terms of triumphant, inspirational stories of people pulling together. There's so much division in our country and our people and across the world. I think we needed a story like this to be told. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, it was personally satisfying to put this all together and realize how much time and effort and blood, sweat, and tears really went into this whole venture to make InteliSwab, to transform the company. And then the third one is, I feel like there has been, during the pandemic, a crisis of trust that's really emerged. The trust between leaders and their people, I think, is pretty is hurting today. And I think we needed stories about how people actually pulled together and worked together, rather than the noise level of daily news, which tells us how divided we are.
Sure, and Steve, you mentioned that in your book. You talk about leading wholeheartedly. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a main theme. Leading wholeheartedly, the part of it that I start with is leading whole people wholeheartedly. And I think what we learned in the pandemic is that we can't, as leaders and employers, treat people like they are just tasked to do something for us. I think what we recognize at OraSure collectively as a leadership team early on is that these were people that were living, hunkered down in their own houses. A lot of two-income couples working in the same room or different rooms, managing school-aged kids who were in school, remotely as well. The division between your personal life and your professional life just didn't exist anymore. And so I think the first thing we recognize is we have to embrace the fact that they're going to have these personal challenges. We can't just treat them like people that are doing tasks for us. And we really needed to appreciate the challenges that they were going through. The other thing was, because it was a pandemic, it didn't matter who you were, what your status was, what your economic status was, you weren't going anywhere. So you were in the same situation as everybody else. So the phrase that I loved during the pandemic was, we're all in the same storm together, but we're in different boats. And so my biggest concern was for each one of those boats and their sailors and crews on those boats. So that's the whole leading whole people part. Wholeheartedly, I think, evolved in many ways, but essentially meant that we have to take care of each other and ourselves. We have to take care of the mind, body, and spirit of each person. And leaders really have to take ownership over delivering that. So certainly early in the pandemic, we had to make it crystal clear and communicate often that the safety and health and welfare of the people and their families was the most important thing.
Sure. Steve, what are some of the other themes that you kind of kept in mind while you were writing this book?
Yeah, so let me unpack the title, because that always kind of baffles people a little bit. So one of the members of my author community, some of whom are here tonight, asked me the question. So after reading the book, he said, so Steve, what does a test for our time mean? Is that referring to InteliSwab being the test of our time? Is it referring to your challenge as the leader of OraSure during that time? Does it refer to the challenge of the company to transform itself? And the answer is it's all three. And it's probably more than that, because the last part of the book is really about what happens next. And the subtitle of the book is Crisis Leadership in the Next Normal. So my projection is that this will not be the last crisis we face in the coming years. And in fact, the next normal, which is what follows this period of time right now, which is kind of after the pandemic, is going to foster more crises that are intersecting each other, that are going to cause leaders and their people to be on guard, essentially, and on watch very carefully. So the book has all those themes together and more. It's a personal memoir at some levels, and so I hope folks get a sense of how CEOs think about things and think about their people. And then, the probably most difficult part of the book for me to write was my life after OraSure and what it was like to step down from a job that I loved, leading the people that I loved, and discover who I was, without social status, without a title, who I was and what I wanted to do next.
Steve, you write about that and say it was a devastating experience for you. What made it so devastating for you?
Well, as one of my dear friends who's an executive search consultant says, Steve, when you're a public company CEO, you only have one of two fates. You can leave too early or you can leave too late, okay? Both have consequences, but when you leave too early, the consequences are really on the person leaving. And I felt like there was still much that I could do. I love the people I work with. I knew we could accomplish much more over time, so it was hard to say goodbye.
I'm sure it was. We're going to talk about where you are now in your career in a couple of minutes, but first, you mentioned and you talk about your time spent in the Lehigh Valley. We talk about how the coronavirus has changed every part of our lives, every aspect, but you've been in the Valley for more than 40 years. How have you seen it change over time when it comes to economic growth?
Well, I think OraSure is a great example that you don't have to have all the resources in place to start a company that actually becomes a magnet for employment and innovation. So it takes the vision and resources of a leader, the founders of OraSure, to make that happen. I think that the Valley is very capable of creating much more innovation with the anchor institutions, mainly the higher education, medical institutions and networks around the Lehigh Valley, those are going to foster a lot of innovation. I think what's fundamentally changed, and this is broadly in the world of economic development, is that economic developers like to think of three things: where you live, where you work, and where you play. Okay, and before the pandemic, all those three things were all together, right? Now they've been disaggregated, right? You and I were just talking about that. You don't have to live near the place that you work.
Sure.
You don't need to play near the place that you live or work, for that matter. And thinking about how that impacts the economy of the Lehigh Valley is going to be, I think, an interesting exercise. I think clearly the valley's become a destination for people that can work anywhere. I saw a vast migration of OraSure bankers who lived in Manhattan suddenly took up residence in the Lehigh Valley, things like that happening. Now, how we begin to cultivate that phenomenon and nurture that phenomenon, and dare I say, tax that phenomenon too, because those folks are consuming resources here, but they're not declaring themselves necessarily as having a work location in the Lehigh Valley. Those things need to be thought out, I think, in the next normal. So I view the prospects here in the Valley very bullishly. I do think the rise of warehousing and taking up massive amounts of space, the report on LehighValleyNews.com about the impact on the watershed and the river, that needs to be looked at very carefully because the appetite to create cross-docking warehousing facilities because of the great location along I-78 is going to only increase. So there's got to be some discipline and planning, I think, put in that as well.
Sure. And Steve, finally, where do you find yourself today? Where has your career taken you? What's next?
I was mentioning this to somebody earlier that I think I'm going to start a club called the I Suck at Retirement Club. I didn't have much of a break between when I left OraSure last year and began writing the book and then launching the book and now on this book journey in itself. But I love where I am right now. I'm relishing writing, blogging, speaking, corporate advisory work, board work, both nonprofit and for-profit. I love the pace of that. I love being a grandfather. I love being a husband and a father as well. So the ability to do things that are on my time versus somebody else's time is very appealing right now. And where this goes from here, we'll have to see. But I've learned a lot in the process. I've done a lot of introspection. I've thought a lot about the profound paradoxes and conflicts that we're suffering through right now as communities and as a nation. And I want to put some energy into helping areas like that, primarily higher education and global public health.
Wonderful. Steve, we have this wonderful studio audience here today. I'd love to open it up to our audience to see if anybody has some questions for our wonderful author this evening. And if you could please stand, we'll have someone come around with a microphone for you.
Thank you. I would like to know what your relationship, am I on?
Yep.
Hello there, neighbor. I'd like to know what your relationship is to Lehigh's exciting new College of Health, if any.
Well, first of all, Karen, thank you and Joe for being here, my former neighbors. And Karen, I used to watch you all the time, Scholastic Bowl on PBS 39. So thanks for being here. The College of Health at Lehigh, I feel a special fondness to. I was actually a member of the advisory board to the Dean of Engineering at Lehigh for many years. That's the group that actually conceptualized of the College of Health. In fact, I work very closely with Vince Forlenza, who is now the chairman of the Board of Trustees at Lehigh, to put together the concept of the College of Health. But I think this is going to be something that's going to be clearly distinguish Lehigh University. And for the benefit of those that aren't aware of this, the Lehigh Valley does not have a medical school, okay? But it probably deserves one. It may get one at some point. But The focus on health and health sciences and health policy and public health are all those dimensions of the College of Health that I think can really make an impact. One of the things I think we learned during the pandemic is the woeful state of public health schools and colleges. Right? Somebody pointed out to me that if you want to see how we as a society treat public health, look at the difference between the buildings that house the schools of public health versus medical schools and universities. Right? Schools of public health are usually the old buildings that nobody wants to be in, and all the money goes to the medical schools. So I think the College of Health concept will be able to influence areas of public policy and health sciences in ways that traditional universities don't have right now. So I'm very, very keen to seeing Lehigh make that happen.
Thank you for that question. I think we had another question.
Thank you, Steve. I just wanted to, I think I told you briefly that I was interested in your book, of course, and I started reading it. So, and I mentioned that you had this analogy between what happened in the Suez Canal and that huge ship that one person basically was able to dislodge it with some persistence and so on. And you made the analogy about OraSure. And I know you acknowledge the contribution of your colleagues in a very good way, at least up to the part that I read. So what made you specifically pick that what happened in the Suez Canal? I'm originally from Egypt, so I know the field very well about the Suez Canal and history behind it. So what made you pick that, even though the person who was behind dislodging it did not attend the celebration, which you acknowledged also in your introduction? So that's typical in Egypt. That happens. So there is also people do things, but no one acknowledged them. But you started acknowledging the contribution of your colleagues at OraSure, which is from the beginning. Just why did you pick that? I'm sure there are other places around it, especially for leadership.
So I want to acknowledge Mohammed Al-Asser, the former provost of Lehigh University, who I've known since the 80s. And has been just a wonderful friend and mentor to me. So what Mohammed is referring to is, in the introduction of the book, I call out the story of Abdullah Abdul Gawad. You may remember when the massive ship, the Ever Given, which is one of the largest container ships in the world, got sideways, literally got sideways in the Suez Canal and blocked traffic there. This is in March of 2021. And you may recall the meme that was circulating on social media about this, which showed the Ever Given, this massive ship, and Abdullah Abdul Gawad in his extractor, which looked like a tiny toothpick at the bottom of a huge bowl, furiously digging at the bank of the Suez Canal to try to dislodge the ship. Well, I think people generally regard that meme as one of two things: either a hopeless cause or a sign of resilience. Okay, and I thought that analogy was apropos for who we were during the pandemic. The ripple effect of that shipping blocking the Suez Canal disrupted global trade and supply chains around the world. So tiny ripples can disrupt the entire world, and that's certainly what the pandemic did. But then you look at this hero who nobody knew about, who was actually risking his life, because what could happen in that circumstance is that the ship could dislodge, or it could literally capsize and crush him. All right, so the odds were against this man just doing his job furiously for several days, and that reminded me of the task that OraSure had. OraSure is a significant employer here in the Lehigh Valley, but in the world of medical diagnostic companies, little tiny extractor. The biggest competitor in the medical diagnostics industry is Abbott. Abbott has 1,000 times the employees that OraSure does. So the odds were against us to begin with. Could we develop this product quickly? Could we get it FDA authorized? Could we massively scale it up? If you would ask me, could we have done that in March of 2020 knowing we had shut down the facilities, that more of our people were working at home, that we had to make provisions for people to work in our factory and people working in our labs so that they wouldn't infect each other, I would have said there's no way you could possibly make that happen. And yet we did. And I think that that's testament to the people at OraSure. Lisa Neibauer, who's here, led the diagnostic unit. I hired Lisa during the pandemic. All right, so she came in sight unseen, never having met anybody on her team, and yet we made it happen. So that was just not supposed to happen. I mean, anybody who thought about the world before the pandemic and how it could translate to the pandemic would not have thought this would all be possible. And that's why I thought the metaphor of Abdul Gawad made a lot of sense to me, and I think portrayed the spirit, resilience, and commitment of the people at OraSure to really make a difference. And I think they have, and I think they are very well positioned to take advantage of that if they want to.
Steve, a test for our time. It's your first book. Let's conclude this conversation by asking, is there another one in the works? What's next? Is there another book in there for you?
I see my wife Jill sighing very deeply. You know, this is a lot of things improbable about the situation. So, you know, I have my degrees in chemistry and chemical engineering and an MBA from Wharton. Over the 12 years of higher education, I think I took 2 courses in English. So, you know, it was unexpected and probably improbable for me to write one book. I'm not sure about a second book, but I do enjoy writing. I blog twice a week. I really do enjoy expressing myself in that way. So never say never, Brittany, but you'll be the first to know if I write another book.
Wonderful, awesome. Dr. Stephen Tang, thank you so much for joining us this evening and our wonderful audience. Have a good night.